I had expected a procedural notation, a line in the session record. Instead, presiding voice Theron Voss stood at the apex of the conclave floor and read every clause into the chamber's archive in full, his secondary throat sac inflating with each point as though the weight of the language required additional air. The Sovereignty Conclave of the Joined Reaches, 7 species, 412 seated delegates, the most powerful deliberative body within 40 light-years, had decided that the formal discrediting of the Terran Intelligence Liaison Office warranted ceremony. I was in the observer gallery. Credentialed observers sat in the upper tier, behind a low rail of brushed alloy, looking down at the main floor. I had a clear sight line to our delegations table, 3 people, center floor, at the half-oval assigned to associate member bodies without full voting rights. Senior Attaché Doman Crowell, Communications Specialist Yuki Arden, and the delegation's junior analyst, whose name was also on the censure document. That was me, Nora Vosic. 22 months of work. 1 report. And now this. Voss reached the 3rd clause. The Terran submission designated File 7 Theta, purporting to document a coordinated pre-incursion posture by the Vreth consolidation along the outer narrows, has been reviewed by the Conclave's Joint Verification Panel and found to contain no corroborating evidence, no confirmed sensor data, and no independently verifiable source material. The panel concludes unanimously that the submission represents either a critical analytical failure or a deliberate fabrication introduced to manipulate conclave policy. The chamber did not react loudly. It was worse than that. The 412 delegates sat in the particular quiet of people who have already made up their minds and are listening only to confirm what they believe. The Varade block, 18 delegates in silver-trimmed ceremonial wraps, sat with their documentation arms folded. The Hesheri contingent, the species with the most territory bordering the Vreth consolidation, the species with the most to lose if our report was correct, had been the motion's primary co-sponsors. They watched Voss with an expression I had learned, over 22 months, to read as satisfied contempt. I looked at Doman Crowell. He had not moved since the session opened. He sat with both hands flat on the table in front of him. No documents, no display tablet, nothing. His jacket was the plain grey of a working attaché, no insignia beyond his diplomatic credential pin, which would be formally voided the moment Voss finished reading. He was 57 years old. He had been filing intelligence assessments to this body for 11 years. He had been right about the Pellery supply route interdiction. He had been right about the Kethcompact's currency manipulation. He had been right about the Vreth consolidation's expansion posture in the outer narrows for the better part of 2 years, filing quarterly updates that the Conclave's verification panel had reviewed, annotated skeptically, and filed without action. Voss reached the operative clause. The Conclave therefore formally censures the Terran Intelligence Liaison Office for the submission of File 7 Theta, revokes the observational credentials of the office's current delegation, and instructs the Terran Associate membership to recall said delegation within 14 standard session days. The Conclave further recommends that the Terran membership conduct an internal review of its analytical methodologies to prevent future submissions of comparable quality. Future submissions of comparable quality. I had helped write the report. I had spent 4 months building the sensor correlation model. I knew what we had found. I also knew what the verification panel had done with it. They had asked the Vreth consolidation's own diplomatic mission for comment, received a formal denial, and treated the denial as equivalent evidence. I had written a memo about that. The memo was not in the session record. Voss set down his documents and looked at our table. The Terran delegation is noted present. The chair invites any final statement before the vote is recorded. Doman Crowell did not stand. He did not open his mouth. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at Theron Voss with the expression of a man waiting for a bus that was slightly late. The silence ran for 4 full seconds. In a chamber this size, 4 seconds is a long time. Voss's throat sac pulsed once. The delegation declines to respond. The motion proceeds to vote. The amber display columns along the chamber walls, 1 for each member block, lit by confirmed vote, began to register. The Varade block, yes. The Hesheri contingent, yes. The Pellery observers, abstention. I watched the columns fill in the particular sequence I had been watching for 3 hours, since the session opened and Voss announced the motion's order of business. 1 by 1. Amber light stacking into something official and permanent. It was at the moment the 6th block confirmed, the conclave had its required majority, the motion was already carried, that the dome changed. I saw it before anyone on the floor did. The observer gallery had the better angle. The Sovereignty Conclave's chamber was a domed glass structure, the apex panel nearly 40 meters above the floor, and through it on a clear session day you could see the upper atmosphere of the station's host body, a pale blue-grey gas giant, and the traffic lanes above it. What I had been looking at for the past 3 hours, a few conclave transit vessels in their standard holding patterns, the distant glint of a supply tender, ordinary orbital traffic. What I looked at now was different. They came out of the transit layer in formation. Not one ship and not two, a wedge of silhouettes that the dome's glass refracted into a hard-edged panorama across the ceiling of the chamber. Running lights off. No transponder pings on the ambient display. They simply appeared, the way very large things appear when they have taken considerable care not to be noticed until they chose otherwise, all at once, and already close. The first delegate to notice was from the Heshery contingent. I watched her look up, look back down, look up again. Then she touched the arm of the delegate beside her. It spread around the chamber in a wave. Not sound, the opposite of sound. 412 delegates going quiet in sequence, sector by sector, as the recognition propagated outward from wherever it started. Display tablets lowered. Documentation arms stilled. Heads tilted back. The amber vote columns were still registering. The sixth block's light was still climbing. The motion was still being formally processed. And the chamber had stopped caring about any of it. Theron Voss looked up from his documents. He looked at the dome. His secondary throat sac, which had been so full of ceremony 20 minutes ago, deflated slowly. He looked at his registrar, a small variety aide seated to his left, whose entire function in this session had been to formally record the censure and the vote. The registrar was already working her console, pulling the transponder database, running a vessel registry query. The registrar found nothing. That was the part that I think hit them hardest. Not the ships themselves, which were large enough to be unmistakable, but the absence of any record of them. She ran the query twice. She checked the Conclave's own traffic control feed. She cross-referenced the Joined Reaches Combined Vessel Registry, which contained the designation, tonnage, and ownership record of every ship authorized to operate in this volume of space. Nothing.
No designations. No flags. No filing.
Ships the size of what was crossing above them, and not a single entry in any archive they could access. I heard it from the gallery. Voss, very quietly, to his registrar, "Can you identify them?" And the registrar, just as quietly, "No, presiding voice. They're not in any register. They've never had a designation filed with this body." The chamber heard it. The ambient noise, the low hum of display systems, the ventilation, the shuffle of 412 bodies, seemed to withdraw from the room, leaving something very still in its place. Voss looked at the Terran delegations table. Doman Krall was looking back at him. Same posture. Hands flat. Expression unchanged. The expression of a man who had been waiting for this specific moment and had decided some time ago that he would not perform any emotion when it arrived. Voss said, "Attaché Krall. Those vessels." Krall let the silence run for a moment. Then he said, "That's the response element. File 7 Theta outlined their deployment criteria." 7 words after the first sentence. 14 total. He said nothing else. He did not explain what response element meant, or what the deployment criteria were, or what had triggered them, or what the ships intended to do next. He had said exactly what the moment required, and he had stopped. I had read File 7 Theta so many times I could have recited sections of it from memory. Buried in the appendices, in language that the Conclave's verification panel had apparently not found worth quoting in their dismissal, was a passage that described what the Terran Intelligence Liaison Office would do if its filed assessment was not acted upon within a defined window. The response was not punitive. It was simply structural, a prepositioned force that the office had recommended deploying regardless of the Conclave's decision, because the threat assessment had not been filed to influence the Conclave. It had been filed to create a legal record of notification. We had told them. We had told them formally, in a document submitted through proper channels, reviewed by their own panel, entered into their own archive. The notification was real, and it was permanent, and it predated everything that was now crossing above them. The Heshery delegate who had first looked up, senior member of the contingent that had co-sponsored the censure motion, got to her feet. Presiding voice. Her voice was controlled but thin at the edges. The conclave should, the session should be. Voss said nothing. He was still looking at Krall. The amber vote displays had finished registering. The motion had carried. The censure was official. Doman Krall's credentials were formally voided, had been voided approximately 40 seconds ago, and the delegate responsible for that outcome was now trying to work out what she was looking at through the dome. What she was looking at, a prepositioned response element that had been in the transit layer since before the session opened, waiting on a timer that had nothing to do with the vote, deployed against an incursion that was already underway in the Outer Narrows, reported in a document that this chamber had spent 3 hours officially discrediting. The Vreth Consolidation's diplomatic mission was seated in the observer section on the opposite side of the gallery from me. 4 delegates, formally credentialed. I looked across at them. The senior delegate, Vreth, with the wide-set lateral eyes and the dark chromatophore patches along the jaw that indicated elevated cortisol, was very still. Not the stillness of Doman Krall, which was the stillness of preparation and patience. A different kind. The stillness of something that has just understood the shape of what it is inside. Theron Voss finally looked away from the dome. He looked at the session record display beside his lectern. The motion was logged. Certified. Time-stamped. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man holding a document that no longer described the room he was standing in. He said to his registrar, very quietly, "Note for the record that the response element referenced in file 7 theta is confirmed present and operating." The registrar said, "And the censure, presiding voice." Voss said nothing for several seconds. He looked at Krall one more time. Krall had not moved, had not smiled, had not shifted his weight or uncrossed his hands or done anything at all to suggest that the last 4 minutes had been a performance. He simply sat there, in the plain grey jacket, credential pin voided, and waited. Voss said, "Noted as entered." Both entries. That was what I remembered most, afterward. Not the ships, and not the silence, and not the look on the Heshri delegate's face. I remembered the registrar's stylus moving. The censure, logged. The response element, logged. Both in the same session record. Both time-stamped within 4 minutes of each other. 14 years later, I still have my copy of that record. I have read it more times than I can count. What it says, if you know how to read it, is very simple. They were told, they chose not to believe, and the thing they were told about happened anyway, exactly as described, on the schedule filed in the document they discredited. Doman Krall walked out of the Sovereignty Conclave chamber that afternoon with his credentials voided and the session record intact. He never filed another assessment with that body. He didn't need to. The record spoke for itself. It always had.